Hi everyone, my name is Brittany J Jones. Mimi has asked me to step in while she's away to record the sew alongs for her new Simplicity Spring patterns. Today we're going to be sewing along to Simplicity 9261, and I'll be making view A, which is the shorter version of this dress in this video. Let's get started. Let's take a closer look at the pattern. Again, we're going to be sewing Simplicity 9261, and I'll be doing the shorter length version on this pattern. Let's take a look at the fabric suggestions on the back of the envelope. On the back of the envelope, you can see that they have a list of suggested fabrics that would be great for this dress. You can also see that they have a list of notions, so you will need some coordinating thread and 1 yard of 1.25 inch wide elastic. You will also need some lining for this dress, as well as interfacing. Let's review the pattern pieces that we will need to cut out to make this dress. We will need to cut out pattern piece number 1, which is the bodice front. We're going to cut 2 from fabric and 2 from lining. Pattern piece number 2, this is the bodice back. We'll cut 1 on the fold of fabric and 1 on the fold of lining. Pattern piece number 3, this is the bodice side front, and we're going to cut 2 of fabric, 2 of lining. Pattern piece number 4, this is the bodice side back. We'll cut 2 of fabric, 2 of lining. We will also need pattern piece number 5. This is the flange. You're going to cut 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. We will also need pattern piece number 6. This is the midriff front. We will cut 1 of fabric and cut 1 of lining. Pattern piece number 7. This is the midriff back. We will cut 1 of fabric and 1 of lining. Pattern piece number 8, this is the skirt front. We will cut 1 on the fold. Pattern piece number 9, this is the pocket facing. We will cut 2. Pattern piece number 10, this is the front yoke and pocket. We will cut 2. And pattern piece number 11, this is the skirt back, and we need to cut 2. For fabric, I'm going to be using this Ponte knit in the color Camel from Melanated Fabrics. Once you have your pattern pieces cut out, remember to cut out your lining as well as your interfacing. We can get started. To get started, the first thing that you want to do is on your bodice front, go ahead and stitch out your dart, and then you want to press the dart going toward the center of the bodice. Once you have it pressed, you can do a basting stitch along the bottom just to hold it in place. The next step, we're going to place our bodice front pieces right sides facing, and you should have transferred a notch as well as 2 small dots. We're going to pin at those dots. Make sure that you go through the other dot as well and just pin in place. Once you have pinned right here at your dots, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch right here between the dots. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. Now that we have stitched between the 2 dots on the bodice front, you want to go ahead and grab your bodice back, pattern piece number 2, and with right side spacing, we're going to pin and stitch our shoulders. So you want to go ahead and find your notch, pin at the notch, and then pin the remainder shoulder seam in place. Once you have the shoulder seams pinned, we can go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitches. Once you have your shoulder seams sewn, you can go ahead and press your seam open. If you'd like, you can trim down some of your seam allowance. We don't need to finish them off with the serger because we are attaching a bodice lining. Once you have your shoulder seams sewn and pressed, we can move this to the side and start to work on pattern piece number 5. Pattern piece number 5 is the flange. You want to make sure that you go ahead and fuse that with interfacing, and you should have cut out 2. So for this pattern piece, we're going to fold it with wrong sides facing like so, right along the fold line. Once you have them folded, you want to give them a press, and then we can go to the sewing machine and baste the raw edges together. So again, fold your pattern pieces together, wrong sides facing, give it a press, and then we will baste the raw edges together. Once we've basted those pattern pieces together, now we're going to go back to the sewing machine and do some top stitching. Starting up here at this folded pressed edge, we're going to come down a 1/2 inch and stitch, and then from that stitch we'll come down a 1/2 inch again and stitch, and then a 1/2 inch again and stitch. We will have 3 rows of stitches. Again, they'll be a 1/2 inch apart. So let's go to the sewing machine and let's begin stitching just one more time. Starting from this folded pressed edge, you want to come in a 1/2 inch and stitch all the way across. Then from that stitch, we'll go down a 1/2 inch, stitch all the way across. From that stitch, go down a 1/2 inch and stitch all the way across. Let's go ahead and do that now. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. And if you're not comfortable with just using your needle guide and needle plate, then you can absolutely use a marking tool to just go ahead and mark out your 1/2 inch lines, and you can just follow those. All right, I'm back from the sewing machine, and here's a close-up of my 3 rows of stitching here. Now we can go ahead and grab our bodice front and back and go ahead and pin and stitch these on. All right, so we're just going to begin matching up our notches as well as our circles. So with raw edges even, I'm going to find my single notch and pin there first. And then just continue pinning. You should have transferred a circle that matches up to your shoulder seam. You want to pin there. And just continue pinning in place. Once you have it pinned on, you want to pin the other one on the same way, and then we'll go to the sewing machine and baste it in place. All right, I have my flange basted on. Now we can go ahead and put this to the side and start to work on the bodice side front and the bodice side back. To get started, we're going to stitch our bodice side front and bodice side back together along the side seams with right sides facing. So I'm just going to grab this one here. I'm going to find my notches and pin there. I'm going to go ahead and do the same exact thing for the lining pieces. We will be stitching those in the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and pin those as well, and we can stitch them at the sewing machine at the same time. So again, with right sides facing, you want to match up your notches and pin in place. All right, now that you have your fabric and lining pieces pinned, we can go to the sewing machine and stitch them at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then press your seams open. Now that we have sewn our bodice side front pieces together along the side seam, and you did it for the lining as well, you want to go ahead and again press your seam open, and my right sides facing, we're just going to pin along this upper edge. I've gone ahead and done it for both of my pieces, and now we can go to the sewing machine and we can stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. Once you have sewn the side bodice, front and back to the linings along that upper edge, you want to trim down your seam and then do a row of understitching. With understitching, you want to make sure that you are stitching along your lining piece. So make sure that you have your seam allowance and lining toward this side, and you want to stitch right along this seam line about maybe 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch away, and just go ahead and do some understitching and then give it a press. Once you have it pressed, then you can go to the sewing machine and do a basting stitch all the way along the raw edge just to keep everything in place. So again, after you have it stitched, trim your seam, do some understitching, press it down, and then do a basting stitch. After you have that done, let's move on to the next step. Next, you want to go ahead and grab your bodice, and I have the wrong sides of my bodice facing out, so you can see my seams here. I have pattern piece number 5 folded in, and this is the right side of my fabric here. And so with your pattern pieces facing like this, again, wrong side is out, you want to go ahead and grab your side front and side back, match up your notches and start to pin in place. So here are my double notches back here. I'm going to match those up and pin that in place. And then for the front, you should have your notch there. You want to match that up and pin that in place. Once you have the notches pinned, you want to match up your small circles and pin in place, and then just pin the remainder of the seams and do it for both sides. Once you have them pinned on, we can go ahead and stitch starting at our dots, going down to the end at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we have the side bodice and lining pieces sewn on, yours should look similar to this. Now we can go ahead and start to work on the front and back lining pieces. So let's put this to the side and grab our lining now. For our lining pieces, we're going to do the same exact thing that we did to the fabric bodice pieces. So you want to go ahead and create your darts in the front. You also want to stitch between those 2 dots that are along the front. Stitch those in place, and you also want to stitch your shoulder seams. Once you have those stitched, we can go ahead and grab our bodice and put this right sides facing. So here's my bodice piece and here's the lining. I'm just going to place it over right sides facing like so. Now I'm going to match up my shoulder seams as well as my small dots and start to pin around the neckline. Once you have pinned all along your neck edge, we can go to the machine and stitch it in place using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You want to drop your needle down here at that small dot and back stitch. You can stitch all the way around, and then once you get here, you want to back stitch again once you meet up with that small dot. You can also start in the center if you prefer and stitch to one side and go back and stitch to the other. But let's go ahead and stitch our lining to the bodice now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and drop my needle here. You want to make sure that you have your seam allowance pushed out the way, so I'm only stitching through these dots through the lining and the bodice. I'm not stitching with any of the fabric over here. And so I'm just going to put my needle down at the marking. I'm going to back stitch and then continue stitching. Once you have sewn your neck edge, you want to trim your seam and clip your curves. Next, we're going to go ahead and pin along our armhole. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my lining and flip everything right side out. All right, now that we have the right side of the bodice facing up, what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to stitch our seam allowances together. So only grabbing the seam allowances. I'll just have this one right here first. I'm going to also grab the seam allowance from my lining, and you need to make sure you put it so that it's right sides facing like so. So if I flip this out, you can see how I have this pinched together here. All right, under here I have the seam allowances pinched together. So this is what we're looking for. After you have it pinched, we're going to go ahead and start to pin. You will also be able to see your notches. Match those up and pin those in place as well. So this is what it looks like. You can just go ahead and pin your seam allowances like so. I'm going to go to the sewing machine now. And if you like, you can do a basting stitch, which I do recommend doing a basting stitch. Go ahead and baste it in place and then flip it right side out to make sure everything is nice and clean. Then you can go back in and do a permanent stitch. Once you're ready to do your regular stitch, I am just going to follow along with the stitch right here that we have that's at a 5/8 of an inch. And you want to just follow that all the way around to the other side. So let's go ahead and stitch this in place now. Once you have it sewn, you want to go ahead and trim down your seam allowance and then flip everything right side out. Once you have your lining sewn, now you want to go in and do some understitching as far as you can go around your neckline. And then once you have that done, we can baste the raw edges together along the lower edge and give everything a really good press. Once you have the understitching done along the neckline edge of the bodice and you have basted the raw edges together on the bottom of the bodice together, you've given it a good press, we can go ahead and put this to the side and start to work on the midriff. Grabbing our midriff pieces with right side spacing, we're going to pin along the sides, match up our notches. Pin the other side the same way. Just a quick double check before we go to the sewing machine. Make sure that on pattern piece number 7 that you have your double notches facing up with the top of pattern piece number 6, and the single notches for both pattern pieces are down here at the bottom. Let's go to the sewing machine and stitch at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have sewn your midriff pieces together, you can press your seams open, and now let's go ahead and pin it onto the bodice. So taking the midriff piece, I'm going to put it onto the lower edge of the bodice. So I'm going to slip it into the midriff, again, right side spacing. You should have transferred a center circle here that matches up to the circle where we stopped stitching at the center front of the bodice. So you want to line up those circles and pin in place. Make sure that you go through the other circle. Again, we're matching it up to the circle where we stopped pinning on the center front. And now we're going to match up our notches and just start to pin this in place. Now that we have the midriff pinned on, we can go to the sewing machine and we can baste this in place. Once we have the midriff basted on, now we want to go ahead and grab the lining pieces of the midriff and stitch them together the exact same way. So here are my midriff lining pieces here. Right sides facing, I went ahead and stitched the side seams and pressed it open. And then along the lower edge of the midriff, I pressed under 5/8 of an inch, and then I trimmed it down to 3/8 of an inch. So you go ahead and do your lining pieces the same way. Once you have them sewn and you've pressed up the edge, you want to go ahead and flip your bodice to the inside. And we're going to do the same thing that we did to the other side with the lining. So with right sides facing, we're going to place this over the lower edge of the bodice, match up our side seams, notches, and our circle, and pin it in place. Now that we have the midriff lining pinned on, we can go to the sewing machine and baste this in place. We can also follow along with the basting that we did for the other midriff. So just follow right along that basting stitch. Then you can check it to make sure everything is nice and smooth, and then go ahead and do your regular machine stitch through all thicknesses. Let's do that now. Back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. Once you have your midriff pieces sewn on the outside as well as the insides, you want to just give everything a good press. Make sure that you still have that pressed edge of the lining pressed under. And then we can go ahead and put this to the side and start to work on the skirt. To get started on the skirt, the first thing that we're going to do is with right sides facing, you want to go ahead and grab your pocket facing. I cut my pocket facing out of the lining just because I didn't want my pocket to be too thick in the dress because I'm using a ponte knit, but that was just an option I wanted to do. So with your pocket facing, go ahead and lay it right sides facing to the front. You want to match up your markings as well as your notch and pin in place. Once you have the pocket facing pinned on, we can go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then trim your seam. Now that we have the facing stitched on, you can go ahead and trim your seam and then clip into your curves. The next thing you want to do is go ahead and turn this to the inside and then give it a good press. Once you have it pressed, you can go ahead and do a row of top stitching right along this curved edge. Now that we have the pocket facing stitched on, turn to the inside and press. I've done my row of top stitching here. Next, we're going to go ahead and grab pattern piece number 10, and with the right sides facing, we're going to lay it over the pocket facing. We're going to match up our notches along this curve and pin it in place. So here's my double notch here. I'm going to pin there. And I'm just going to pin all the way along this curved edge. Once you have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch all the way along this curved edge, and then you can finish off your seam allowance with your serger. I've gone ahead and done this side here, so this is what the inside of mine look like. So again, we're just going to go ahead and stitch around the curved edge of the pocket, and then we can finish off the seam allowance. So let's go to the sewing machine and do that now. All right, once we have the front yoke and the pocket sewn on, you can see mine is sewn. I finished off the raw edge, and then I pressed it and based the raw edges here along the top as well as the side together. I also gave it an additional press, and then I finished off the raw edges with my serger. So this is what my skirt looks like on the outside, and this is what it looks like on the inside. So now let's go ahead and start to work on the back. For our back pattern piece, you want to go ahead and lay your pieces right sides facing and stitch your center seam, being sure that you stop at the dot that we have transferred. So you can see I stopped here and stitched to the top of the center seam. I also finished off my edges, and then I pressed them open flat. So once you have your back pattern pieces sewn together, again, be sure to stop at that large dot. We can go ahead and lay our skirt pieces right sides facing, and then we can pin along the side edges. So go ahead and find your notches and pin there. And then just begin pinning down the side seams for both of the sides of the skirt. Once you have the side seams of our skirts pinned, we can go to the sewing machine and go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have the side seams of our skirt sewn, we can go ahead and attach it to the bodice. So grabbing your bodice piece, we're going to sew this right sides facing. So we're going to be sewing only using the fabric, making sure that we keep the lining free. So I'm just going to put this right sides facing. I'm going to match up my notches as well as my side seams and pin in place. And remember, we want to keep the lining free and out of the way. Once we have pinned our skirt to the midriff, again, we're keeping the lining midriff free. We can go ahead and stitch this all the way around using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have the skirt sewn to the midriff, you want to trim down your seam, and then you want to press it going up toward the bodice. To close off this area, you will fold over the midriff lining like so, and then grab a needle and thread, and we'll just slip stitch this area closed. After you have that slip stitch, the last thing to do is the hem. For the hem, you will press up the hem allowance on the hem of your dress and fold in 1/4 of an inch of that raw edge. Give that a press and then stitch close to the pressed edge. And also on the slipped opening, you want to press over 5/8 of an inch, and then you can press in 1/4 of an inch as well, and then stitch this in place. Once you have your hem done and your slip stitching done, you are all done with this dress. Well, that is all for this sew along, and I really do hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Be sure to tag Mimi G Style in your makes so that she can see and share them on social. Until next time, blessings everyone. Bye.